Welcome, everyone, to the start of Season 2 of Dax's Deviance. This season is going to be a little bit more focused on the research side of things and kind of discovering who you are, what you like, and kind of how you can get to know you and your kinks in a more detailed context. So to start, the inaugural Season 2, I am joined today by the fabulous Dr. Richard Sprott. So, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'd be happy to. So I am Dr. Richard Sprott, and I am a developmental psychologist. I got my degree from UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, back in 1994. For at least half of my career, I've been really focused on the development of sexual identity and the connections between sexuality and health. And since 2012, I've been doing specifically a lot of work on kink identity. Actually, before 2012, I was doing some work as well, but really have focused a lot on this intersection of kink and health. That has included looking at the development of kink as a sexual identity. I currently have a number of different projects that are all about investigating how people understand themselves as a kinky person, high points and low points on their kink journeys, looking specifically at the use of kink for healing from past trauma or from difficult childhoods. So there's quite a lot that I've been doing in this particular area. I'm also involved in the Division 44 of the American Psychological Association, which is the Society for the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, where I used to be, I was for 2021-22, I was president of the division. And now I currently co-chair their BDSM task force. So that's just a little bit of what I do. Mostly it's a lot of research.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of research, but it also sounds very interesting. And kind of, how would you say those experiences have kind of shaped your overall research? Kind of the different jobs that you've done in your previous research. How have they kind of shaped the research that you're doing going forward now?
It's been a big part. In fact, in my career, I spent the first half of it really looking specifically at child and adolescent development. In particular, a lot of language development, social development. But about halfway through, I decided to switch over to adults, and in particular, looking at identity. And I had two main areas. One was sexuality, and the other was identity related to work, to careers and work. And I did a number of projects around the development of professional identity, professional work identities. I was always drawn to, in essence, the edges. So when it comes to work, I was looking a lot at how people form work identities when the work itself is an emerging profession, one that's not widely recognized, not really organized, but people struggling to form, right, a sense of their self around work that was sometimes not recognized by the culture as being sort of like prestigious or legitimate work. So I look at things like doulas, and I also did some work specifically around morality and professional behavior, professional development. And all of that was going along. And in parallel, I was doing a lot of work on sexuality. And I did some work early on, and actually a project that's still continuing to today, is looking at kink identity. trying to figure out what does it mean when someone says, I'm kinky, or all of the different identities and labels and titles that people use in the kink community, like master, pop, boy. And so I've been doing a lot of work on that ever since. It's been fascinating.
It sounds absolutely fascinating, and I'm looking forward to delving into more detail, kind of regarding the kink as a sexual identity side of things, because that seemed to be something that was popping up quite frequently throughout the papers that I had read. So to start off with, this is going to be a 3-part mini-series within season 2, focused around who am I. The 3 episodes are going to focus on understanding your sexuality, understanding your kinks, and understanding your body. And each one of these will be looking at 2 papers which have been done by Dr. Sprott. I do apologize for calling you Dr. Sprott. That is my bad. So we are going to have a look at these first, and we're going to start with understanding your sexuality, which is looking at your 2 papers, which is Sexuality and Kink Identity and the Kink Sex Queer Boundary. So,
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about the research from a queer boundary. Kind of give me a premise of it, because I've summarized it, but I would like to kind of hear your summary of the paper and how you interpreted the study.
Well, the study comes, excuse me, that paper comes from an ongoing study, which I call the KISS project, KISS, which is the Kink Identity and Sexuality Study. We started it back in 2014, 2015, by conducting in-depth interviews with about 72 people. We decided to keep it localized to the San Francisco Bay Area in California, where I am. And we had these in-depth interviews with these 72 people, really to explore what does it mean when they say they're kinky, and how do they relate to the community? How do they, what are the high points and the low points on their kink journeys? And in fact, we're still analyzing data from that set of interviews. One of the things that popped out pretty quickly was that in these, talking with these 72 people in depth, their relationship between kink and sex was very complex. Some of them actually approached and talked a lot about how their leather life, their kink life, their BDSM activities were completely different and separate from sex. There were a few people who really maintained a strong boundary between kink and sex, and for some really interesting reasons. Most people, though, thought of kink and sex as essentially a blending together. Even a few of those people thought that, in fact, BDSM and kink and sex were essentially the same thing, even if it didn't look the same or involved orgasm in the same way. They felt like the experience of it was essentially the same. So we had this huge range of how people understood and managed the line between kink and sex. And so we looked really, really closely at that for this particular paper, trying to describe and try to understand how sex and BDSM interacted. And what we came up with, of course, was trying to describe this range. And people, in fact, talked about um, it in some unusual ways sometimes. Like, for example, those people who really said, no, kink is one thing and sex is something completely different. Some of them separated it out because in some cases, people wanted to maintain a monogamous relationship with their primary relationship, but they were kinky. And here they were either in a relationship with someone who was not kinky, or they were in a relationship with someone who was kinky but did not have the same fetishes, the same kinks. So they didn't have much in common, even though they were both kinky. And in that situation, they wanted to maintain a monogamous relationship, but they also felt a need to explore their kink. And so they basically said, I keep BDSM and kink separate from sex. I keep sex just for my primary partner, and I have some play partners, but we don't do sex. So we'll get together, we'll do bondage, we'll get together, we'll do some, flogging, we'll do some pup play, but we won't necessarily allow it to go into the direction of sex. So it was to maintain their values around monogamy. Some people kept kink and sex separate because, in fact, they were pro doms. They were sex workers, professional dominants who wanted to keep, in essence, their professional life separate from their personal life. And so they maintained the sexual part as being reserved for their personal life, and not necessarily for their work. So they had a strong distinction between kink and sex for that reason. Other people just felt like there were a couple people who just felt like the headspace for BDSM or kink, the energy for BDSM or kink just felt differently than what they experienced when they were doing, sexual stuff, uh, orgasms and genitals and all that stuff. So for them, they experienced it as being in a very different kind of headspace. And so for them, it was relatively easy to kind of keep the kink part, their kink activities, separate from their sex. So we noticed that, and yet that was still like maybe 20% of the people that we were talking with were keeping a strong boundary between kink and sex. Most of everybody else, it was either a blend, or in fact, it was the same thing. And for them, a lot of it was, well, I do BDSM and kink because it's arousing. It gets my sexual juices flowing. It's an aphrodisiac. It is an enhancement. It's a spice that we add to our sexual play together, our sexual fun. And so it increases the experience, the intensity of it, by having it be partly, including fetishes or including some sort of power exchange. So for them, it was a lot of, well, it's not exactly the same thing. Kink and sex are not exactly the same thing, but one blends into the other. One adds to the other. It arouses one into sex. And then for a small group of people, probably about 10 or 20% of the people we talk to, their sense was that the energy involved, the arousal for sex or the arousal for kink was really coming from the same place. Um, they've experienced it as not just one sets up for the other, but that they flow together so much that you can't really put a boundary between kink and sex. And so we went through all of this and went through these interviews and really noticed these patterns, and um, found that to be really quite interesting as to all the different ways that people were approaching this 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 experience, this question about kink and sex and how do the two go together. It's interesting because most people, especially outside of the leather community or people who are not kinky, they often assume that kink is really all about sex. And one thing that you really get when you talk very about people who are, really experienced and really strongly identify as kinky is that often BDSM and kink have these dimensions that are really not about sex, or even kind of related to it. So assuming that it's just all about sex, it really can distort, I think, people's actual experience. And yet, at the same time, it's clearly a very erotic experience, at least for many, many, many people, even if it doesn't include, orgasms in the way that we normally think.
Yeah, and it's the kind of takeaway that I got from the paper, is that, yeah, as much as there is people that find that that sex and kink are kind of a mutually exclusive thing, there is people that have them totally separate. I think the way I summarized it was, the paper examines how individuals who identify as kinky navigate their sexual identities and the boundaries between their sexual and BDSM activities. The study uses qualitative data rather than quantitative to highlight the complex ways in which kinky individuals perceive and engage with their sexual orientations, emphasizing the fluid and often non-binary nature of these identities.
Yes.
The kind of key takeaways that I've jotted down. I think this is the paper that I looked at first when my Mac decided to die and wipe all of my notes. Technology problems, love it. So the key takeaways were boundary management, which was where the participants reported managing boundaries between sex and BDSM in diverse ways, often seeing them as intertwined rather than distinct. The identity complexity, saying that it found that BDSM practices can influence sexual identity, making it more complex and fluid. And the community influence, which is the kink community provides a space for individuals to explore and express their sexual and BDSM identities safely. I don't know if that you would kind of agree with those kind of key takeaways there.
Yeah, that's we look specifically a lot at that, not just kink and sex as behaviors, but also as identities. This was in a different paper. We focused specifically on bisexuality, pansexuality in particular. And when we just looked specifically at that group of people that we interviewed, we saw a lot of, and this applied to actually all of the people we interviewed, and that was kink often, and getting involved in BDSM and kink, and sometimes the leather community, the kink community. It allowed people to explore aspects of their sexuality that otherwise they did not, or perhaps could not explore. So what we often find, and from other studies, I have larger studies that also suggest this. Sometimes getting into kink enables a person to um, realize that, in fact, their attraction to other people, their arousal from other people and other kinds of activities is more fluid or more complex than what they used to think about themselves. So sometimes kink allowed people to explore their sexual orientation. Sometimes it allowed them to explore their gender in ways that they didn't or couldn't before. So we did find that, one of the things we find in a lot of our work, even right now, is people who come into kink and primarily identify as heterosexual, often many of them will start to go, well, maybe I'm heteroflexible, or maybe, I can do a kink scene with if I'm a man, I can do a kink scene with another man without it necessarily being sexual, but it comes right up to that edge, or it blends kind of. And so maybe I'm not as straight as I used to be. And so a lot of people will start identifying as heteroflexible or pansexual, or even recognizing bisexual because of their explorations of their kinks and getting involved in the kink community. So sometimes, getting involved and really exploring your kinks becomes a way to also explore other aspects of yourself, like who are you actually sexually attracted to, or what kinds of things are you sexually aroused by. So we did see a lot of that, a lot of people going, oh, my whole idea of who I am as a sexual person is changed. My sense of it is different because I've allowed myself to explore my kink. So we did see a lot of that. And it's not just, is this a sexual behavior, but it started really flowing into, who am I as a sexual person? What is my sexual identity? We
Yeah,
also noted that people often started to think about their kink as a sexual orientation itself. So, like, if you were to ask, are you lesbian? Are you gay? Are you straight? Some people would be like, you know what? I'm kinky. That's what I am. So that for some people, they experience their desires for kink as something as fundamental as your desire for a particular gender or a particular sexual identity, like gay or lesbian.
yeah, and I think that's an actual really interesting aspect that kind of connects all of the kind of research papers, is that there is this kind of overarching theme of people that have been in heterosexual relationships and they begin exploring their kinks, and it kind of leads them to realizing, hey, actually, I don't think I'm, fully straight. I'm straight for this aspect, but for this aspect, I'm actually bisexual or even gay. And I think kind of the connecting themes in that regard, especially with the people mentioning that they identify as queer as a kind of branching term to identify as kinky, was something quite interesting to read and kind of put things into context, because it's something that I personally definitely agree with, where there is certain aspects where I feel like kink is a bigger aspect than the kind of sex side of things, but in other aspects, sex is more important than the kink. Um,
Yeah.
so, kind of going through that, I can kind of see where a lot of these participants are coming from with these kind of statements. Um, so, I'll ask you some questions about the paper based on kind of statements that I've got here. So, in this paper, you and others have written approximately 45 to 60% of general population have fantasies involving dominance/submission in some way. Approximately 30% have fantasies involving whipping or spanking, and 33% of the general population have engaged in kink behaviors at least once in their lifetime. So, in terms of kink behaviors for the general population, do you think engaging in kink behaviors at least once in your lifetime is important to discovering your sexual identity?
Yes. Because we see so many, there's such a big difference between, I mean, if you're trying to find out, is someone kinky, you really have to be specific about, like, well, because there are so many people who have kink fantasies and even kink desires, but never do anything about them or
Yeah,
never share their kink fantasies. And that's actually a pretty large part of the population. So if you say, well, how many people are kinky? Well, if you mean by do they have kink desires or kink fantasies, it's a huge number.
yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting that, though, most people don't try to enact them. They don't try to make them happen. Um, and so if you look at that portion, what you do find is, and I suspect that, um, there's a smaller portion of the population that is uh, open enough or high in sensation seeking or some other thing, or perhaps even just somewhat connected to a sex positive community, that they feel like they can maybe try to actually do these fantasies, actually try to see how it feels in real life. And so you do get that portion. I think what makes them kind of special, or what enables people to actually try it out, is going to be some sort of combination, I think, of personality, sex drive, but also what's the social context. Does the social context sort of enable or encourage exploration or not? And so when you add all that in, it seems like those people who actually go out and try to do kink can they're a little different than the rest of the population, because they really are more um, maybe sexually adventurous just across the board, or maybe have a high sex drive for all kinds of sex, not just kinky sex.
Yeah,
And so it becomes pretty important to go, okay, these people who really try it out are a little different. And then you get the people who actually build a life around this, right? A very strong kink identity, very involved in the kink community, build their lives around it, maybe do work that's related to the community, like making toys, or having some sort of kink business, um, or becoming a kink researcher, or something like
yeah,
that, where you just kind of like, oh, I can actually build a life around this. Those people are much smaller. It's like, I don't know, 5 or 10% of the population, maybe 5%. that can actually build a life around it and make it more central to who they are. And that group is, again, has a lot in common with the people who just dabble or the people who just do it every once in a while. But because it's so much more central, their sense of self is different, I think. And so um, for a lot of them, they really do experience it as something like, uh, I haven't chosen this. This is not something I can turn on or off. This is a part of who I am. If I try to suppress it or ignore it, um, I will suffer. Um, Not everybody who dabbles in kink, definitely not everybody who has fantasies about kink, feels that way. But there is this group that's pretty core to the community, um, to the lifestyle, that is actually feeling and experiencing their kink as if it's a fundamental part of themselves, and they really can't ignore it or suppress it without doing damage to themselves.
Yeah, I've definitely met individuals like that where their kind of kinks or kind of their sexual presence is kind of the forefront of who they are, and definitely it's engaging to kind of see that people embrace their sexual and kink side so fervently. But you also do have that kind of worry in the back of your head of like, okay, so when they go home and they don't have that, how does that affect them? Because I know people that they do really well at the big kink events, because they are able to kind of show themselves fully, be who they are, and live their best life, as it were. Um,
Mm.
but then when they go back home, they don't have that level of self, because maybe they're in an area where they don't have the same connections, or maybe they just don't have, like, say their friends are, you know, a few states away, that sort of thing. They don't have the same level of connection with people to engage in these activities. So I definitely can understand the kind of mental impact that would have on someone not being able to kind of live their true self.
Right. And we live in a culture that is actually, that really stigmatizes kink.
Yes.
Um, and sometimes you internalize that, I must, and that's something I work a lot in my professional life. I'm doing a lot of work with mental health providers, therapists, and psychologists and counselors, because often, um, as people are struggling with all of these negative messages about kink, that they sometimes internalize them and end up feeling like a tremendous amount of shame or a tremendous amount of disgust at their desires or at their fantasies or even at their behaviors, and and that leaves people an incredibly difficult place, in a place that actually can increase the chances of them having depression or even suicidal thoughts. So, we look at that, and it's a recognition that we live in a social context, we live in a culture, in a society, or in several societies,
Yep.
that really think, for example, that, I mean, there are a lot of stereotypes, like kink is violence. right? You're just a violent person. You're an abusive person. There's something wrong with you, like you must have been damaged as a child, that you're selfish, that that somehow in some way you're not a psychologically mature person, that this is kind of like, I don't know, adolescent or childish to have these desires or to live your life like this, where your kink is kind of more central to your life. I mean, there are all of these messages that somehow in some way kink is bad, and it takes a lot to resist that. It takes a lot to create a subculture, a community where all of those things that people think are bad about you are actually good. And so that's one of the things we tend to look carefully at the ways in which people struggle with this kind of stigma. In a particular area, in other studies that we've done, we've looked, for example, at do people even come out as kinky to their healthcare providers, to their doctors and nurses, and to their even to their families and things. And so many people do not come out. I think we found in a lot of our samples that at least half of the kinky people, right? These are people who identify as kinky, but they won't tell like their mental health provider that they're kinky. No matter how long they're with that person. They could be going in and doing therapy for years around, maybe trying to recover from, neglectful parents, or some trauma that happened as an early adult or something. And they could be working on that for years, and they will never tell, right, the therapist or counselor about this side of them. We find that, in fact, they're less likely to even come out to their doctors and to their medical providers, even though they want to, even though they have questions about, well, I'm doing this thing. Is that bad for me? Is that dangerous to my body?
Yep. Yeah.
I have questions, and they won't ask because they're afraid of the reaction.
Yep.
They're afraid of being discriminated against. So we see that a lot in our work. And that's just one way in which dealing with the stigma of kink impacts people's health in ways that we really would like to change. We don't want this stigma because it ends up really damaging people.
Yeah, or they don't get the healthcare that they could require just from fear of being judged. So, yeah, but we will discuss that in the third point.
Okay.
So moving on to the next question. So the statement I've got here is, several studies asked about the sexual behavior repertoires of people who identify as kinky, but none of these studies specifically asked if the sexual behaviors occurred in the context of a kink scene. And my question for you is, why do you think this wasn't asked, and what would you expect the results to find if it had been asked?
Well, I really only know of like maybe one or two studies that ask specifically about your sexual behavior in the context of a kink scene.
Okay.
I think only one. And I think that's a reflection of a couple of things. One is that often, uh, on one level, researchers are still just trying to grapple with what is this, right? How do we define this kink, this behavior, this identity? So often, a lot of things that immediately grab your attention are like the obviously kinky behaviors.
Yeah.
And so they ask about those, but they don't ask necessarily about other aspects of sexuality. So sometimes that's just where I kind of see it as a mistake, but a common mistake when you're starting to explore an area that just has been ignored, or that nobody has really done any work in. So, I mean, part of it is that it's the field of kink studies is really new, and so we're at the beginning. Um, but sometimes I think it's because there often is an assumption that that BDSM and sex are the same thing, or BDSM is a sexual behavior, in spite of the fact that we know, right, that doesn't work that way for everybody.
Yep.
Um, um, and yet, I think the researchers sort of assumed, well, you know, we don't really need to go into great detail about the sex because, of course, they're having sex. Um, and so I think that's another reason why people don't ask um, about it and about what's going on. There's starting to be some attention, I think, paid to, oh, it's not just that there's this huge range of BDSM behaviors and BDSM kinds of relationships. There actually is this whole range of sex and sexuality that these people are engaging in. And not all of it's going to look like your stereotypical sex, but it is sex. So that's one of the things that a lot of people find sort of liberating, freeing about getting into BDSM, is that it often takes the sexual focus off of your genitals, off of having an orgasm. That becomes less less the focus, less the goal,
Yep.
less the intention, because there are all of these absolutely wonderful things being experienced with kink and BDSM, and everybody is having a good time in a different experience. And so, is it really important that I get hard in order for us to really have this fantastic experience? No, actually. So suddenly, a lot of people find that pressure or that focus, uh, that when it's taken off, right, the pressure's off, the focus is on something different. Then all of a sudden, they're having an incredibly good time, and they realize that their sexuality is bigger than their genitals and their orgasm.
Yeah. And just kind of off the back of that, the next quote I've got is, men experience less distress about sexual dysfunctions in a BDSM context than in a non-BDM context. So based on that finding, do you think men with sexual dysfunctions are more likely to use kinks to engage in kind of sexual practices, or even just, having these kind of more intimate experiences with, be it men or women, or, transgender? Do you think they're going to kind of use that as their outlet?
That's a great question, and I don't think we've really gone out to get the empirical data on that yet. Are they more likely to do kink because they have a sexual dysfunction? My sense is, I don't know that they're more likely to do kink. Um, I'm pretty sure that, therapists and doctors are not saying, oh, you're struggling with, for example, erectile dysfunction or something like that. You know what you should try? You should try kink. I'm pretty sure they're not saying that,
Yeah,
right?
I doubt they would be saying that.
So, so on the other hand, it is the case that people, when they discover kink or they start to explore their BDSM, they discover that, oh, you know what? The fact that things aren't working the way I want them to or expect them to when it comes to my, genitals or my orgasm, you know what? That's okay. I'm still connecting. It's still a very intimate experience.
Yeah.
I'm still having fun. Um, it's not detracting in any kind of way from this connection. So maybe, you know what? Maybe it's okay. So I definitely think a lot of people discover that kink is liberating in that way. I don't know if they go, oh, maybe I need to do kink in order to do my sexuality in a way that doesn't only focus right on my genitals or on my orgasm. So I definitely think that when people walk through the door into the leather community or into BDSM, they discover this, but they don't know about it beforehand because, again, so much of the culture is like, well, this stuff is dirty, this stuff is nasty, this stuff is, a sign of somebody being broken. This is violence, this is abuse. So you don't get the message that, you know what, this expands your sexuality. This allows you to explore in so many different ways of how to connect to another person. So therefore, you should try it, and it can be one way to adjust to and adapt to a body that is changing or a body that does have some sort of perhaps organic problem that it does prevent you from having an orgasm or does prevent you from getting hard.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic answer for a question that I think I kind of just threw at you. um, no, definitely, I agree with you that, obviously people aren't going to be, oh, you have this issue, you know, have you tried, getting spanked, that sort of thing. Um, but I definitely feel like people that discover kink are going to probably use that as a form of release, maybe not orgasm, but definitely a form of intimate connection, in my opinion, anyway. Because I've known people that have had things like erectile dysfunction, and the kind of the way it affected them mentally, because they feel like they couldn't perform, or they felt like they weren't good enough, they couldn't please a partner, that sort of thing. um, and they use maybe pup play, or they might engage in activities like fisting as a way to bring pleasure to others, but in their own way get pleasure from that. Because a common kink that I can think of is um, people being service tops, or um, service bottoms anyway, where the main pleasure isn't their own. They get pleasure from others getting pleasure. Um, so I feel like kink in that regard can help with the sexual dysfunctions, be
Mhm.
it erectile dysfunction, or um, you know injury or lasting too long, lasting too short, that sort of thing. I definitely think that using kink is definitely a way that people can still engage and still have these experiences without the need for, either using genitals or reaching their own orgasm, sort of thing.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, I agree.
So the next one I've got is the participants made the distinction by constructing sex as requiring genital contact and/or intercourse, and highlighting how BDSM can be emotionally and/or mentally arousing without involving genital contact or sexual intercourse. So, can you elaborate on why participants might describe BDSM activities as sexual even in the absence of genital contact? And what does this suggest about their understanding of sexuality?
Well, I think it highlights the fact that you can engage in BDSM and feel some sort of arousal, even sexual arousal and desire, and yet your body doesn't necessarily show it, or it doesn't necessarily affect your genitals or things like that. It becomes then, oh, that's right. Arousal and attraction and desire uh, don't equal, right, a particular state of my body. That my body, and this is something that's just true about human sexuality in general, and that is the body can get aroused, or the body can get not aroused, and that's different from your mental and emotional experience. um, and so there is a kind of difference between what's going on in the body and what's going on in the mind. And um, the idea that somehow in some way the two are the same. Well, if you're not getting hard, you must not actually want something or desire something, or in fact, maybe you don't even feel any kind of arousal, and that's just not true. um, so there is this uh, sort of simplification that happens. And so when you start doing BDSM and kink, and you discover I'm having this experience, and it might be very intense, and it's different than what my body is doing or what my body is demonstrating or showing. Um, and you start to have those experiences a few times, and you start to think, well, you know what? Um, the relationship between my mind and my body is actually pretty complex. And
Yeah.
so maybe I shouldn't just assume that they're the one and the same, like there's no difference. In fact, appreciating the difference allows a person to really become much more nuanced and willing to, in fact, engage in things, even if they have an experience with their body that the body's just doing its own thing, or is not cooperating, or isn't doing it like you used to, right, when you were younger. um, all of that, I think, BDSM allows us to really understand the complexity of what it means to be in a body, and to have these sort of intense, intimate, connecting, even amazing experiences, um, when in fact it just is experienced differently than what we're told to expect.
So, kind of talking about the culture surrounding both kink and sexuality. You wrote BDSM communities have developed a specific sexual culture of high priority of sexual needs and the celebration of sex, leading to skills in communicating about sexual fantasies, desires, preferences, and practices. So, in this context, are members of BDSM communities more confident in their sexuality and ultimately themselves because of this culture?
My feeling is the answer is yes. They are more confident, and the culture really supports that and enables that. I think um, the there's such a premium, a value that is placed on exploration, um, on being on the edge, on exploring, on trying things in the kink community. And so the more that you're involved, the more you have opportunities and also messages that basically say, on one hand, there is the value of don't shame someone because of their kinks, in spite of the fact that does go on,
Yeah, obviously.
even in the kink
Oh, yeah,
community,
it's bad.
right? And yeah, it is. But at the same time, there's at least some messages about how, don't, um, I don't know if you've heard this one, don't yuck my yum.
That is a new one to
Don't,
me.
is it?
Yeah, I've not
Okay,
heard that
that's,
one
that's
before.
kind of an older one. I learned it from hanging around with and working with primarily the heterosexual kink community is where I first really started
Okay.
hearing it. Um, and and I loved it because it basically it highlights that that whole kind of kink shaming involves to a certain degree it involves disgust,
Yeah.
right? Oh, what you're really into is disgusting. um and the fact that we get all of that messaging all the time about our sexuality, um and then to actually get it within the community is really uh I mean, it's one of the things we're really looking at in our research is like how often does that happen and what's the impact, because there is this sort of sayings like don't yuck my yum, don't you're not supposed to shame other people for their kinky desires, no matter if they're like, very different from yours or not. Kink is such a large umbrella. We have to, in some ways, um, be welcoming and to tolerate many different kinds of fetishes and many different kinds of ways of doing kink. And yet, people do still, even if they sometimes like know better than doing something that is really denigrating somebody else's kink, it happens, right? And so there is this, we really don't want that to happen, even when it does. We try to um, be pretty clear, you know, that's not for me, or I'm not attracted to that. It's perfectly fine,
Yeah.
right? For you to say, I'm not interested in that scene or that kink, um, and not to and to have that not be rejecting,
Yeah.
not be like expressing any kind of disgust. It's different though if you say, "Well, that's just disgusting." um,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden you've really crossed the line, uh, and yet we know it does go on.
Yeah. And kind
Uh,
of from a kind of psychological point of view, what kind of effect would that have on an individual that is kind of exploring their kinks, and they've maybe found something that they enjoy, to be met with someone telling them, that's disgusting, that there's you shouldn't be doing that sort of thing. Like, how would that kind of affect them when they're on this journey of kind of self-discovery?
It hits them very hard. Um, there's nothing quite like, oh, wait a minute. I thought I was in a welcoming space. I thought I was with people who understand or who value, this kind of expansive view of human sexuality. I thought I was with people who, um, they make allowances for or they really support all of these other things. Then to discover that, in fact, something that you really find very arousing or very interesting, um, or something that is actually pretty important to you and your own understanding of your own kink is somehow in some way uh, not allowed, right? Or outside, or will get you rejected. Um, that hits really, really hard. And what we've noticed is that people often, it's so reinforcing of the messages we already get that somehow, in some way, there's something wrong with me, or I'm damaged, or um, this, or, there's something about me that is disgusting. And um, to get that from people that you don't expect it from, or that you hope you don't get that from, can feel like a betrayal.
Yeah.
It can feel like, in fact, often the thing is, well, there must be something really wrong if even these kinky people are like, oh, that's disgusting.
Yeah.
So where are you left other than to believe there really is something wrong with you? And that can be very damaging to one's sense of self, one's self confidence, one's self esteem. Um, it definitely can feel very isolating. Like, I better not let people know I'm really into this. Um, and so you're already feeling somewhat isolated and different from most people. And now you've got yet another experience that makes it feel like um, there are very, very few people, maybe nobody, who will understand you or will even think you're okay.
Yeah.
So it can be very damaging. We certainly know that that kind of internalized negativity uh, really does damage people's psychological well-being. So,
Yeah. It was something that kind of I experienced firsthand at a festival this year, a festival that is meant to um, celebrate, kink and sex and all the wonderful nuances around it. Um, One of my close friends was in in a lounge, which is called the Alpha Deck, but you don't need to be an alpha to be there. It's just kind of their fancy way of saying VIP lounge. And he is into ABDL, um, which I think is an absolutely fantastic kink. I have tried it personally myself. I'm indifferent to it. I do enjoy it now and then, but it's not something I have as one of kind of my primary kinks. And when he was up there, he overheard people say things along the lines of, I can't believe someone would be into that. Why would they be allowed up on the alpha deck? That sort of thing. And the effect that had on him
mm,
was quite upsetting to see. But thankfully, I was able to speak to someone who's quite well known, as they used to help organize a lot of the stuff for this festival. And they spoke to the organizers to make sure that this sort of thing was explicitly said as basically don't be a dick. And, you know, everyone's kinks are welcome. Kink shaming is a very big no-go. But it did kind of ruined his night. But thankfully, the wonderful handler David was there to come to the rescue and have a chat. Because handler David he's very good with the kind of headspace side of things and kind of helping people get out of very negative headspaces into, you know, a more positive one. But yeah, seeing that firsthand was kind of like, you know, I don't really understand why, you know, we're all here to celebrate the wonderful diversity of kink and people are making comments like that. It just seems a bit backwards, really.
Yeah. And in fact, even in our own research, like in the International Kink Health Study, our earlier 2016 Kink Health survey, we looked pretty carefully at the levels of stress and people's sort of traumatic experiences in their childhood and adolescence. We looked at their current experiences of discrimination, even within the kink community, and people who do ABDL play are some of they're most stressed out because they are isolated, because they are rejected. Your story just illustrates that so well. And, you know, even though that didn't involve like violence or anything like that, it's still so wounding, you know, it's still so damaging and hurting. And we found that there are certain kinks out there that really do get it, not just from the larger culture, but even within the kink community. And that often leaves them in very difficult and very isolating places, which is not good for their mental health and not good for their physical health.
No, definitely not at all. And kind of talking about a different subject, gender and sex roles. You've got a quote from Bauer, 2007, that says, playing with gender and sex roles and identities pushes for a focus on the psychological rather than embodied aspects of sex to decenter the focus on bodies as the core of sexual activity. So in your opinion, does focusing on the psychological rather than the embodied aspects of sex allow for deeper connections with kink and or sexual partners?
This is one of those very complex areas I'm still
Yeah.
trying to figure out. On one level, it seems like kink and engaging in BDSM is so. What a lot of people find healing about it is that it makes me connected to my body,
Yeah.
right? More in my body, and so that's going on, right? And yet, at the same time, as Robin Bauer's work shows, it allows us to also play, to have like new and creative ways of connecting to our body, in ways that really highlight that what's really important is the mental or emotional aspects and not necessarily what's going on physically. So, you know, I find the whole aspect of embodiment as being a key aspect of kink, but and embodiment being really important in terms of often healing. Um, but at the same time, uh, all of these possibilities around gender and all these possibilities around, well, what can I do with my body, um, becomes also really important, which kind of feels like, well, you know what? There are all these other things going on that are different from and maybe even separate from your body, that are just as important to your sense of self, or to your sense of pleasure, or to your sense of sexuality. So yeah, we're not relegated or stuck into only a particular way of being embodied, but we still often are really connected to our bodies in ways that um, are new and creative. Uh, and so it becomes very complex. It's like, yes, kink allows for this exploration of gender and of bodies, and whether or not your body is working the way it's quote unquote supposed to. And yet at the same time, feeling more connected to other people, more connected to your own self, connected to your body. Um, it's an amazing thing. It's complex, and I think everything that Robin Bauer was saying is absolutely true. I've certainly heard it from all the people who participate in our studies, and yet at the same time, there's something a bit transcendent or something a bit creative about kink and BDSM that that seems to go beyond our limited ideas of what it means to be in this body. So it's fascinating, but it's really complex.
Yeah, it sounds like there is quite a lot to consider, kind of from various aspects. But it definitely sounds like the study is there, and you guys are kind of working towards kind of yourselves and Bauer, to kind of answering these very, how do I word it? Yeah, very transcendent questions of consciousness, really, and the connection with mind, body, and soul, and all of that. I definitely think kink plays a part in the triad there. Okay, so negotiation aspects of BDSM scenes allows asexual people to be clear about wanting a scene without sexual contact, and they reframe sex as just another kink. So, taking this statement into account, how do you view kink interactions for asexual individuals?
Well, it's one of those examples where that boundary or that line between kink and sex is pretty complex.
Yeah,
I mean, in many ways, BDSM allows people to become very intimate with each other, to connect, to have amazing experiences without it necessarily involving all of the pressure and expectations around sexual
yeah,
performance. So, so that's one of the reasons why a lot of, well, some at least, asexual people really go, "Wow, I have found this community where I can connect with other people, and in fact, my desire not to have sex is just treated like, it's just another aspect of another person's kink,
yeah,
or it's really, as that quote said, it's a kink in and of itself, to in essence not want to have sexual contact and sexual orgasm. And so it's one of those things that, again, really highlights that whatever we're doing when it comes to kink and BDSM, it's so much bigger than sex. That, in fact, people who are really not wanting to connect with someone else in that way can still have an amazing connection with someone else in a way that's really fully satisfying to them. So when you start to appreciate how BDSM and kink is connecting and intimate and allows us to have so many different ways of being embodied, that you just make room for whether sex is there or not. And asexual people just find that so amazingly liberating again and freeing, because if it wasn't for kink, things become somewhat limited in how they can connect and relate to other people. So much of our culture is, well, if you really want to connect and be intimate with someone else, you have to have sex.
Yeah.
So, it's like, oh my gosh, look, here's a culture, here's a place, here's a group of people that don't expect that, don't necessarily pressure that to happen, and that has got to be felt as very welcoming.
Definitely. And kind of when thinking about these kind of kinks that asexual individuals would kind of be more inclined to engage in, what kind of springs to your mind? Because I would imagine pup play would be kind of one of the more common ones that I could think of. Kind of the interviews that I done in season 1 of the podcast, it was a very mixed bag of people taking part in pup play for the social side of it. Some people were taking part in it for kind of the sexual side of things. But it definitely feels like pup play is one of these ones that would be more of a welcoming community for asexual individuals.
Yes, definitely. That's got to be near the top. I think people also, when I talk with asexually identified people in the kink community in my work, often bondage is mentioned.
Okay.
As, again, a kind of, well, you know what, you can tie me up, I can tie you up, and it becomes, again, kind of like an art form sometimes. Sometimes it's a particularly amazing headspace. You can kind of float. You can feel that maybe power exchange of being helpless. All of that stuff can happen, and it doesn't involve sex.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't involve, so I see pup play, bondage. I've talked to a few who've also talked about flogging, or spanking, a sort of
Yep.
impact play, as being, I really like that. And again, we can do that, and it doesn't have to involve sex. So I tend to think of those three: pup play, bondage, impact play, as being, I mean, those are like fairly common kink activities. It's pretty easy to find people involved in those. And so therefore, and they're like perfect examples of how, well, you could do them without involving sex.
Yeah.
And still have a great time.
Oh, definitely. So, I agree with that. Because I've seen kind of both sides to those kinks where, it is either just playing and the social side of things, or the kind of more sexual side of things. So yeah, I would kind of agree with that kind of top three there. Um,
Yeah.
so kind of talking about this study overall, it mentions that the study used a snowball sampling method. Can you explain
Hmm.
why that was used in this particular study? Because I know it was used in a couple of the other studies that we'll be discussing. Why do you go for the
Oh, yes.
snowballing method?
It becomes a very useful method of finding participants when you're trying to work with a community that is hidden and a community that is stigmatized. Um, so, it becomes a little difficult to, like, uh, find people. So snowball sampling is where, you find someone, they agree to be part of your study, and then you ask them, would you please spread the word of mouth?
Yeah,
Would you please go out and tell your circle of friends or your little group or your community about the study and ask them to consider being part of it. So because it relies so much on that kind of personal connection and who knows who, um, and that can happen in ways that don't attract, right, the attention of the government or
yeah,
of people that you're not out to, so that it kind of preserves people's privacy and confidentiality, while at the same time, trying to find enough people that you can go, oh, you know what? I think we have enough people here, and this is what they're saying, that we can start to really trust uh, what we're finding.
yeah.
So I tend to find that, especially with the kink community, um, snowball sampling often, in some ways, is often the only way to go. Um, Maybe not quite. I mean, there are studies out there that um, have attempted to um, like randomly call people in the entire country,
That
or
seems like an interesting
some sort
approach.
of.
Yeah,
Yeah, that would be. And there have been a few studies that have done that, who've just sort of like, I'm not going to randomly call people, and in fact, one was just published, um, in uh, in Switzerland, in the canton of Geneva, I think. And in either place, in looking at a particular population, and you want something that's representative of that whole population, you just have to sort randomly calling people.
yeah,
But that's not going to get you a large number of kinky people. That helps in lots of ways, and that's a very important method for trying to get a sense of, well, how many people have kink fantasies, and things like that. It becomes really important. But if you want to dig deeper into something like, so what is the relationship between kink and sex, you need to talk to a lot of kinky people,
yeah,
and
definitely.
that becomes, you just can't call everybody and to find those people. It really helps to go, would you please help pass this on? Please let people who are kinky, that we're doing this study. And so it definitely has that advantage. It has some disadvantage, like, we're clearly, um, when you're basing it upon that, it's much easier to find people, for example, who are really connected to the kink community, right? Because they're now talking to each other and all that stuff. But that doesn't really necessarily help you with, what about those people? What about that person who's doing kink, but they're not actually part of a kink community?
Yeah,
They're doing it on their own, right, in the privacy of their own home, or it becomes really difficult to reach those kind of kinky people
Yeah, well, that was
with
kind of
either
one of
method.
the follow-up questions I was going to have was, with the snowball method, I think it's fantastic, that you kind of you're able to get your target audience, via word of mouth, and to take it down to its most basic form. But in that scenario, are you worried that it might, potentially skew the data because you're only having data from one specific group? Or, you know, I know you'll have, kind of criteria, but are you not kind of worried that by using a method like that you could be, as you said, missing out people that are maybe not connected, or only involving one specific group and maybe missing another because the groups aren't connected, kind of that sort of.
Hmm. Oh, we worry about that all the time. And as I said, it's very difficult, which is why, in the field or in the science, you want people to use multiple methods,
Yeah.
not just one. And so that's why to a certain degree, I like the population sample studies, the representative sample studies where they just randomly call people, let's call 2,000 people and see, uh, 2,000 people living in the UK and see what they're doing in terms of kink or how they feel
Yeah.
about like the boundary between kink and sex. I would love to do that, as a kind of um, partnered or adjunct kind of way of trying to get at what's going on. Um, I don't know of. I mean, essentially, that's what we're left with is either calling people randomly or sort of word of mouth, or snowball sampling. I mean, it's just that we can put, the only other way I know is uh, doing things like this podcast, or
Yeah,
doing things like
exactly.
um, sending a message to a group, a local kink club, and asking them, hey, would you tell your members? um, I mean, that's kind of what we're left with in order to reach people. And there are pluses and minuses to all of those.
Yeah.
So we really do need studies that do it all. Um, and we can put them side by side and hopefully try to get a clearer picture of what's going on. So definitely, that's one of the more challenging aspects of working in this area is how do you reach people, and especially people who are not strongly connected to these social networks or to these groups or to this community. That's always something we worry about.
No, and that is very understandable. Um, I think the only way you would, be able to reach them is to have little, business cards saying "contact us for this study" in packaging for gear and things like that, which, not very cost effective.
Mm.
Um, but kind of talking about the second paper, which is the one on bisexuality, pansexuality, queer identity, and kink identity, which you sneakily mentioned earlier. Um,
Yes.
kind of talking about that paper, I have it summarized as the paper investigates the relationship between bisexuality, pansexuality, queer identity, and kink identity. It explores how individuals with non binary sexual orientations, such as bisexuality and pansexuality, engage with kink practices and how these practices intersect with their sexual identities. The study uses both quantitative and qualitative data to understand the experiences and identity negotiations of individuals who identify with multiple non normative sexual and kink identities. that hitting the mark?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, magic.
Um,
So kind of talk me through the paper. Talk me through how you done your research and kind of what your primary findings were from this paper in particular.
well, again, actually, the paper itself was prompted by there was going to be a special issue that focused primarily on bisexuality.
Okay.
And so there was going to be a whole series of different studies and from different people in different labs, all like what's the latest on bisexuality. And I thought, if there's one thing about working with the kink community is that you run into a whole lot of pansexual, bisexual, homoflexible, heteroflexible people.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, this whole intersection of kink and this sort of multi-sexuality it's very rich. It has an important. I don't know that people actually recognize or know just how many people who are pansexual or bisexual or in the kink community who study things like bisexuality, because often kink is not on their radar. So I thought, you know what, we have this data. About a third of the people that we interviewed identified as, not gay, lesbian, and not heterosexual, but somewhere in that realm of bisexual or pansexual, or
Yeah.
even people who just like, I'm queer, and not wanting to put a clear definition to that, but just like, I am not part of the normative population. And so we decided to really dig into that. And that's where a lot of things started coming up, like, oh, these people are often using kink to explore. I mean, how did they become pansexually identified? Well, it was through kink.
Yeah.
How did they become, and still what we find is that it's a lot of bisexual and pansexual people find that the kink community is more welcoming, definitely more welcoming than non-kinky communities. So, for example, one of the things we find over and over again in sexual identity research and looking at sexual identity and health is that bisexual people are often, even though they're a larger part of the LGBTQ umbrella, they experience a lot more stress because they get rejected by the gay and lesbian community and they get rejected by the heterosexual community.
Yeah.
So they kind of get it from both sides, right? So a lot of them have discovered that, oh, you know what? I don't get rejected or ignored or somehow in some way dismissed when I'm in a kink community, when I'm in the kink circles. And they found that incredibly like welcoming. And again, that sense of empowerment and liberation. And so we were really like finding this as like, wow, this isn't just like, hey, there are a lot of bisexual people in the kink community. It's that they find the community in many ways more welcoming than other communities. So that was really interesting to really look at. And then the whole thing about oh, well, kink allows people to explore their gender, to explore their sexual orientation, not just to explore kink, but to
Yeah.
explore these other parts of themselves. And so we had a lot of stories of people who like, well, I became bisexual, or I came to accept my bisexuality or pansexuality um, because of kink or because of my kink exploration,
Mhm.
and found that to be so. It's not just, hey, I'm bisexual. Oh, by the way, I'm also kinky. Let me now discover that this is actually a pretty good combination and I'm not rejected. It really is. I came into the kink community thinking I was gay or thinking I was straight. And now I realize that my sexuality is broader or bigger or more fluid than that. So it was a very interesting, kind of deep dive into uh, that set of interviews that we did. Um, and it's still one of my favorite papers, one of my favorite analyses that we did on that data.
No, it's a very good read. I I actually quite like the fact that you can kind of see just what the participants have said. I very like the inclusion of that. Um, I think my problem is that because I'm from a kind of biological background, the research that I'm used to reading is very much we done this experiment, here's this data, have a graph, have some microscope pictures. So this feels a lot more personal because you're getting to kind of not only get the analysis of the data, which I love, you're also getting to see kind of the raw data of what the participants
Mm.
have said and kind of how they interacted, and then the kind of what the takeaway from that is, which I think is great because you can really see how kink and the interactions around their sexual identity are having an effect on their life, and kind of you know the validation that they're given from the kink community in kind of terms of this study. Um, so I think that was kind of one of my key takeaways was the identity validation, which you've mentioned, where people that are engaging in these kink practices can validate and affirm their identities and provide a sense of community and belonging, which was
Yeah.
kind of, I think it was only one person that kind of rejected the community from kind of
Mm.
reading through, but everyone kind of felt that general sense of community. Um, so, kind of going into the questions from little snippets that I got from the paper, um, one of the first ones I jotted down, and this was before I did my analysis on the understanding your body side of things, was these studies find a relatively low incidence of overt discrimination from therapists, and yet there is evidence of a fairly high rate of non disclosure to therapists. Um, why do individuals not want to come out to their healthcare provider?
I so much of it is really about I anticipate. We call it anticipated stigma. That is, I think that if I were to come out, that my doctor or my therapist would think I'm doing something wrong, I'm a danger to others, that
Okay, yeah.
uh, will just reject it. So there's that part, and so much of it. I mean, the point of that is, we do have horror stories of doctors and therapists just being terrible when they discover that a patient or a client is kinky. So we do have a number of those.
Yeah.
But in fact, it doesn't happen as often as we fear.
Okay.
And so there really is that kind of like one of the things that I don't know, we try to work towards is letting people know that yeah, there is a chance that you're going to have a really terrible experience, but it's not as frequent or as common as you think. Now, what's more common or more frequent, if you do come out, is that the doctor or the therapist will just not know what to do or say.
Yeah.
Um, they won't be rejecting. They won't say there's something wrong with you, but they also will not know what to say. And so sometimes what we find is we call it sort of therapy derailment, in the sense that things going off track because now the therapist either completely ignores it. Oh, you told me you're kinky. I'm not going to ask about it, and we're not going to explore that. I'm just going to pretend that you didn't say that
Yeah.
because I don't know what to say. Or what you sometimes get is, oh my gosh, you have to tell me more about that. And suddenly everything becomes focused on your kink,
Yep.
even if that's not what you want or need.
No, it's
So,
yeah.
yeah, it can become pretty difficult. And so I can understand why some people are just like, even if they've had a past experience of coming out and it not going all that great, even if they don't have like outright discrimination. But if it just doesn't go very well, so many times people are like, you know what, I'm not going to bring it up. I just don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, and that's understandable.
Yeah, it is. In fact, we heard from a number of times from people, both about therapists and doctors. It's sort of like, well, if I bring it up, and I have in the past, um, and then all of a sudden I'm getting all of these questions, and it feels like all of a sudden I'm teaching the therapist or I'm teaching the doctor rather than the doctor helping me or the
Yeah.
therapist helping me. And so we call that like you know uh, paying someone else to teach them, and it's like that's not why you're here.
No,
You're here for
exactly.
help.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I,
And so people are like, you know what? I don't worry about being rejected by them. I just don't want to deal with that.
no, I do think I have questions regarding that sort of side of things, based on some of the later papers, kind of in regards to, you know, there was an opinion in one of the papers that, yeah, as you said, they're going there to get help. They're paying this person to get their help, and they're having to then explain in detail and teach them, about themselves. It seems kind of a little bit backwards, so they won't reveal that fact, because it just seems like a waste of their own money. Um, and another one was, not wanting to reveal from, fear of, the line of questioning that will go down, if they're going to assume that there's, domestic violence involved, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, but we will get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
So, given the wide range of behaviors or styles encompassed by kink as an umbrella term, There's a number of options for self-identity and objects of sexual desire that provide opportunity for exploration of sexual orientation and gender. So, what do you think of umbrella terms of common sexual identities where individuals have not explored kink? So, when I say kind of umbrella terms of common sexual identities, I'm talking heterosexual, gay, um, that kind of side of things. So, what do you think of, people that say I'm exclusively straight or I'm exclusively gay, in terms of having not explored kink?
Mhm. Well, I mean, now I'm going to have to go out on a limb here and really think um, about that, because in identity theory and in identity development work, we recognize something which we call identity foreclosure. And that is where essentially I'm adopting an identity without having done any exploration.
Okay.
Okay. So we know that a lot of people in lots of different parts of their life, different domains of life, religious, political, spiritual, sexual, will adopt identity without having tried out different options or explored different possibilities, and that will be felt very, still again very strongly. Um, so we recognize that people can be so certain and clear of their inner life and their experience that they don't need to explore. Like I just know, right? This clicks for me. Um, this clearly fits me. So I do recognize that people can feel that about their sexual identities without having done any kind of exploration of kink. And remember, like, well, yes, a lot of people have had kink fantasies from time to time, at least. Um, Most people don't feel a need to explore it.
Yeah.
It's just something they think about every once in a while. Um, and so, I mean, I respect all that. I think that, that doesn't mean their sense of identity is not as real as somebody who has explored all these different things and said, you know what, this is what fits me. Now, we find that for the most part, um, people's ego strength and their sense of being grounded in themselves tends to work better when they have explored and then come to some sort of realization or decision. Oh, this is who I am, or this is what fits me. So there is a sense in which, having done the exploration, you are more certain, but it's not necessary, right, to have a strong sense of self, a good self-esteem, or anything like that, that you have to explore. So, when I think about, all these people out there with sexual identities and they haven't even tried kink, or they haven't even, tried to explore things in a way that, you know, sounds like kink. Um, I think that that's quite valid. That people are perfectly happy and healthy in those situations. I think, though, most people, and this is one of those basic things about identity. In many ways, the label or the identity, like gay, lesbian, kinky, whatever, um, those those are essentially boxes, right? That are given to us by the culture that we try to negotiate with the culture because those identities, on one hand, help us to have a sense of ourselves. On the other hand, they help us to connect to other people. Like, I know how to interact with you now that I know which box you're in. And yet, at the same time, everybody's an individual. Everybody is unique. The boxes don't always fit, right?
Yeah, no,
The labels don't always capture you.
and that makes perfect sense.
So so in that sense, I sometimes think, well, there are people out there who haven't explored, but who don't feel exactly comfortable with the box or the label they've been given. And that can feel very, sometimes it can feel very distressing. But at the same time, because you haven't explored, you don't know what the options are. So you end up kind of sometimes being somewhat insecure in your identity because you haven't explored, because the identity doesn't quite fit. But it's the only thing you've been given.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are the people that I think, you probably would benefit from a little bit of exploration. Maybe doing a little bit of kink would help.
No, definitely.
But so I think, so much of it depends on, how much does this identity fit? We've actually, in our own research, have started asking that question when we ask things like, please describe your race or ethnicity. Please describe your gender. Please describe your sexual orientation. Which of these boxes do you click off? We started asking the question of like, so how well does that fit for you? You clicked off, right, heterosexual. How well does that actually fit? And that follow-up question is really interesting because I'm starting to see that, even people who are like, I'm straight, cisgender, non-kinky, and finding out that actually, while a person like identifies in that way, not all of them are actually pretty comfortable with that.
Yeah, okay.
So it's become like, what? Don't just assume that because a person has an identity that they feel like it really fits them.
Yeah.
Maybe they just haven't had a chance to explore.
Yeah.
So this is the wonderful and funny thing about identity, which is why I study it. It's like, wow, it's really quite this thing which is really a reflection of who you are and how you connect to others, and yet at the same time, it's not static. It changes. It can be fluid.
Yeah. And kind of jumping on the back of that, the study continues to say, in terms of queering categories of sexual orientation or gender, researchers and community-based authors alike have noted that for some people into kink/BDSM, the gender of their play partner is less important than the activity or scene itself. So this kind of just reinforces what you were just saying. But because it continues to say that a gay man might have scenes or ongoing relationships with heterosexual women. In this context, where would sexuality fit into the exploration of kink? Because, as you've mentioned, the exploration side of thing kind of helps people get to where they are sexually. People can use a blanket term and say, hey, I'm gay, But then they can have these experiences with, say, in that example, a heterosexual woman, and then they become homoflexible. So, kind of where, in your opinion, does sexuality fit into the kind of flexibility side of the kink exploration?
Well, I think that for some people, there's probably a couple things. One is, well, when you start to really explore your kinks and your fetishes, and, you know, w- one of those things, I think, because already you are doing things which are outside the norm, outside the expectation, that once you break out of, right, that sort of society given box, uh, and you start going, oh, there are other possibilities, that it's not just about like, oh, I like to be spanked, or I like to be tied up, or I like to be blindfolded. It is also, oh, I'm kind of maybe attracted to different kinds of bodies.
Yeah,
Maybe I am attracted to, like, oh, you know what? I actually, here I am, a heterosexual man, and I actually am attracted to like uh, 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 transgender women, or maybe transvestites. Maybe, it becomes sort of like, oh, yeah, I'm still attracted to women, but there are these aspects of it which I haven't really thought about before that I do find actually attractive. And I didn't know that before. So suddenly it becomes, the line between the line between exploring different activities and different fetishes, it's not that difficult then to start exploring, like, well, different genders or different bodies,
yeah,
and not just, different activities or different, costumes and clothing. So I, I think some people um, find that, well, if you're already exploring outside the box, here's just another box, and maybe I can explore outside that too. And they do. Um, so I don't. I know also that people can explore kink without ever thinking, oh, I want to try kink with a different gender or a different, maybe a different sexual orientation. I know that that also, it happens, right? People don't necessarily explore or question their sexuality or their gender while they're doing kink. So it's certainly not the case that everybody who does kink ends up being essentially, right, somehow in some way pansexual. Um,
no, exactly.
but I think it, yeah, but I think it at least opens the possibility. And given that people are pretty complex, I'm not surprised that a lot of people might actually be like in the middle or in between, or, not really being captured by any of these boxes, which we might call non binary, right?
Yeah,
So, I certainly think that it opens up the possibility. There are a lot of people who would find that really helpful, really empowering and liberating. And there are going to be people who, great, it opens up the possibilities, but I'm pretty sure about what I like.
yeah,
And it's not going to change just because there's more possibility.
yeah. Um, and kind of the next line of question that I've got for you is kind of focused on some of the participants and kind of statements that they've made. So some of the questions are going to be kind of they're going to sound like dumb questions, but it's just so I can kind of get kind of what you took away from what they had to say. Um, so
Okay.
the first one that I had is from participant 106, who is a 45-year-old cisgender white female. And she says, I consider myself to be queer. I consider myself to be a leather person. Kinky is a big umbrella. Uh, US leather people fall into kinky. I used to be, I used to use the label leather dyke, but I've grown and I've changed. So have my definitions of myself. I'm still a dyke on many levels, but queer is a much broader word. I sleep with people who don't identify as women. I am not heterosexual. I'm a switch, also poly. So, based on her response, would you say she has a firm understanding of her sexuality?
That's a great question.
As I said, it's to me writing it down. I was like, this sounds like a really dumb question, but I just it's one of these statements that when I read through it, I was like, to me, she sounds like she's very grounded in her
Yes.
interpretation of herself. And I just kind of wanted to get what you thought of her response and kind of what you think how grounded she is.
I think I definitely in the interview and in the experience and knowing this person a little bit outside the interview, I would say this person is very grounded and really kind of knows themselves. And what you're hearing there is, in fact, um, in at least the way I interpret it is this person knows themselves and what they know about themselves doesn't fit the boxes.
Yeah,
So it can sound to somebody on the outside, it can sound like, well, you can't pick a box, so therefore you must be confused. And in fact, it's more like, no, you really know who you are. And guess what? None of the boxes fit.
yeah. That's kind of what I took away from that was she has a very good understanding of herself. She's very grounded in who she is as a person, and the societal norms of you know are you a lesbian, are you know bisexual doesn't really apply here. I think the term she used of kinky and queer is kind of from what I took away, kind of more how she would identify. But then even then, there's not. I don't think there is kind of one particular box. Um,
Mm.
and talking about participant 76, who is a 29-year-old queer identified white cisgendered female, she said, the top arching term I use for kink is still queer. For me, it is an umbrella term that encompasses kink. I am definitely involved in the queer community. So, in this context, she is using kink as a sexual identity. And how does this play into individuals who identify as heterosexual but are involved in kink, which does include same sex interactions?
Yeah. Ah, another good question. Um, Here, I think, you know, given the complexity and given the fact that, who we are as unique individuals never fits exactly every box, right? Um, at least at some point or some part of your life. Um, I do feel like in some ways that's like two ways of looking at the same thing. Um, so somebody can look at this kind of complexity and go of who they are and go, you know what? The easiest thing to do is just to claim a label, claim a box that in and of itself is not very specific, or includes quite a lot of things. Things like queer, like kinky. And if I do that, then I don't have to, I'm not limited or defined by a category, by a label like heterosexual. So, I'm just going to say I'm queer. I'm just going to say I'm kinky, and that's not just my kink interest. That's also my sense of my sexual orientation. That's my sense of my gender.
Yes,
because I'm kinky and queer.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in a sense, I'm going to choose the box that actually has a lot of room in it. And that's different, but I can see where somebody would be like, I'm still going to stick with the box I came in with, which is like I'm heterosexual. But now my understanding of it, or I'm not so rigid about it, or I'm going to identify in that way, but I'm not going to let that limit me as to like what's going to happen, or I'm not going to just ignore those times when I do find myself attracted to somebody of the same gender or the same sex. I'm going to recognize, well, you know what, that happens from time to time. That still only happens every once in a while. So that doesn't mean I'm fundamentally different, or fundamentally I have to change the way in which I understand myself. So I think that sometimes people can approach it and go, what, this box is definitely more specific
Yep.
than kinky and queer, but I'm not going to let the box be rigid. And to me, those are like two solutions to the same problem. And is one better than another, or is one more accurate than another? Probably not. Is there something kind of similar about those two solutions? Maybe, yeah. I think, this is who I am, and I'm not going to be limited by that, versus I am going to be this thing which, has all of this fluidity and flexibility in it. You end up kind of in the same place, which is, you know what? I'm not going to be defined by any one specific thing. And I tend to find that when it comes to sexuality and gender and kink, that the younger generations really like that. They don't want to be limited in the way that older generations have been. And so they're much more likely to go, you know what, I'm queer, or I'm kinky, or I'm, this cisgender heterosexual woman, and that doesn't necessarily define all of my, experience.
No, exactly.
Or who I am.
Yeah. And kind of talking about things that don't define people who they are, I feel we need to mention participant 42, who his story is quite an interesting one, and it was one that I definitely felt is kind of a recurring theme that I have noticed in certainly more middle-aged men than kind of any other group, because I've seen it in kind of, especially here in the UK, a celebrity case that was kind of like that was Philip Schofield, where he was identified as straight for majority of his life, and then came out live on TV at, I think he was in his 50s when he came out. So participant 42 is a 50-year-old white cisgender male who has a bisexual identity. And an excerpt of what he said was, "Now I'm really more gay than I am straight. The more I open myself up to being able to say that I am gay, just being comfortable with that opens up a flood of need that has been repressed." Um,
Mm.
so this man has repressed his kinks due to a vanilla sexual relationship with his wife, but through exploring his kinks was able to understand he is bisexual, as he enjoyed kink with men and sex with his wife. Do you think this mentality is more common in the general population, but a lack of exploration is keeping individuals from realizing their, and I've put in quotes, true sexual identity?
I think bottom line, I think my answer to your question would be yes, that this is more common than people realize. Certainly, the um, this is one of the things again, which why I like to study this stuff. I always feel like it's still kind of a mystery, and yet at the same time, so complex that it just makes me want to try to understand it. Um, and that is people's thoughts, feelings, experiences, what they get turned on by and what they're aroused by, doesn't always fit the script or the box. And so, therefore, and yet, without the script and without the box, it becomes very difficult to actually connect with other people or to play a role in society. So it's sort of like we're left in this situation where we need the labels and the roles and the boxes in order to function in society, to have a sense of ourselves, even though all of those things don't quite fit.
Yeah,
So, so often you're kind of like stuck, or always constantly dealing with these sort of uh, sometimes conflicting motivations or conflicting needs. And so, and how we try to find a balancing point, how we try to make sense of all that, how we try to integrate all of that so it all comes together, is in fact our lifelong project.
yeah,
It is the thing we're constantly engaged in. So, because of that, I'm uh, always trying to understand how is it that people are actually coming to, at least for this moment, coming to some sort of resolution between all of these conflicting pushes and pulls and motivations and needs, and to get a sense of themselves in a way that is healthy and is maybe stable. And so there's a part of me that is sort of like, it's pretty clear that it is very healthy to have an identity.
mhm,
People who don't have strong senses of identity don't do well. Um, and at the same time, to have that sense of identity but not be trapped by it.
yeah,
And and so, a lot of the quotes, I think, that you've just read recently, from our studies really kind of highlight that. They really highlight people. My concern often is when people feel like they have to cut off part of themselves in order to fit. I don't think that's healthy. Um, and and so, I see people who, and hear stories all the time of people who feel like, well, there's only one way, or there's only one right way, or there's only um, one healthy way um, of being who I am, and will then end up in many ways trying to damage themselves in order to fit.
Well, that is
And
kind of one of the follow-up ones that I had was, do you think societal norms such as heteronormative and the taboo that surrounds kink is another factor preventing individuals from exploring their true sexual identities?
yes, okay. Um, and when I think about that, I mean, I think the answer is yes, people do because of these norms. And um, the what tends to be underneath that is this idea that um, uh, I think ultimately it is about, if I don't fit in, I will be rejected. If I don't um, do this right, other people uh, will reject me, and and that's what I think people are often afraid of and trying to avoid. And so they will do all sorts of contortions and um, do things that kind of ignore or deny parts of themselves because they really are trying to avoid being rejected
Yeah.
by other people, and sometimes by very important other people. So it is a kind of struggle to be dealing with all of this identity stuff and to find some sort of way of being true to yourself, of being grounded in yourself, and not let other people determine who you are, and or the society
Yeah.
in general. And where I think most people end up developmentally, what we recognize is, often there's a stage of the development of the self where you really are kind of dependent and defined by your relationships, by what other people think of you. Um, and in fact, that's actually an important stage in development, but you also can't stay there because then ultimately that means um, uh, you really are determined by other people who may or may not, really understand you or really have your best interests at heart.
Absolutely.
So you have to somehow grow into that, but then you have to grow out of it. And when people grow out of that, really caring about what other people think or caring about what society thinks is right and good, is you have to construct and build for yourself your own sense of what's right and what's good. And those values and what you think of as like what's really important enable you to withstand the peer pressure or the societal pressure. But you have to work towards that of like, this is what I think is really important. This is what I think is like the most valuable thing in life. And so when we work out our principles and values, then we can organize our sense of self and organize our lives around those things. And that's what enables us to kind of escape the um, the sort of damaging aspects of societal pressure or the damaging aspects of other people's expectations. But it takes a lot to work into that. Takes a lot of life experience. It takes a lot of reflection. It takes a lot of really caring about like, who am I, and not just settling for like the first answer or the easy answer. And the more that people do that, the more I think they have a stronger sense of themselves, and they're not necessarily defined by these other boxes or labels or what other people think. So I think that's what a lot of people are working towards in their adult life is that sense. And there are a number of things I think that kind of help with that. I do think that to a certain degree, if you can find a a sexual community, a kink community, a sexual identity community, or something, which is not that doesn't quite fit, right? The normative mainstream picture. That by doing that, you are on the way to really being able to like define your own principles and values, because you're already kind of like, you know what, normal society doesn't fit me.
Yeah.
So who am I? So,
No, and that's
so that's those are my those are
yeah.
my thoughts on that.
And I mean, it's really really interesting, and it kind of does lead me on to the next big question, which is kind of looking at both the papers we've looked at. Of overall, how does kink tie into sexual identity?
Well, again, I mean, you have to build on the whole, well, what's the relationship between kink and sex? And you have to build into what's the relationship between sexual orientation and kink? And by the time you've done all that, or gender and kink, and by the time you've done all that, I think you've got your answer, as to how does this tie in. Kink becomes a way of exploring and a way of building up your sense of self, your values, and your principles. It's a way of exploring how to connect with other people that's outside the normal expectation. And because it enables all of that, I think kink can really facilitate personal growth and healing. So, because of that, I think what does that mean? It means that essentially kink is one area that is especially suited for this kind of personal growth. Now, not everybody is kinky, and not everybody wants to enact their kink desires and fantasies. So, it's not going to be the path for everyone, but it is a legitimate path, and it is a valuable path, and it really helps some people.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I've kind of seen in first person how it helps some people. And based on your research, how does the use of kinks affect sexual identity in individuals that are closeted?
Well, being closeted often means, this is one of those things where when we think about it, or when we talk about, like when I was growing up, um, one of the things I heard over and over again as a gay man was the most important thing you can do is come out. And to a certain degree, there's a lot of sense to that, because if people don't know that they know someone who's gay, then they don't have a chance to really challenge those negative stereotypes and that stigma, and those distorted images of what it means to be gay. And so coming out, when you're talking about an aspect of a person that is not readily available or readily seen, can really be an important catalyst for changing society. and an important step in really being able to claim a positive self. And claiming a positive self is really important in people's health and well-being. So I would say that we're often in the same situation when it comes to kink. I understand that there's a lot of discrimination, and I understand, I know that there's a high cost for some people to come out as kinky, but the more that we do it, the less costly it becomes. The more that those people who are in a position to come out without, damaging their families or their livelihood or their place in society, I think the more that they can do that, the better off everybody is.
Yeah.
So I really do feel like perhaps the kink community can be a little bit more proactive in encouraging people to come out. Could be a little bit more like we need to build the resources in order to protect the people who do come out. And if we did that, life will eventually become easier and easier, and people won't feel like they have to hide.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, we would see positive changes in both society and in people's mental health.
Which
So
would be great to see.
I do. It would be great to see. It would be, and ultimately, that's what I'm after in my own work. I really do see that. Bottom line, what I'm trying to do is to increase the health and well-being of people who are kinky.
Yeah.
And so part of that is going to be kind of like being a little bit more out there, and showing people that their ideas about what it means to be kinky is not correct, or is not complete, or is not is distorted,
Yeah.
and maybe change some minds, and maybe change the way that society does function. So a lot of my work, I mean, at least one level of that is trying to enact sort of social change to enable people not to be so afraid to come out.
Yeah.
Um, and yet at the same time, it's like, you can't just pretend that society is going to be welcoming you with open arms. There are a lot of people out there who really still strongly believe, right, that being kinky means something is broken, or you're damaged, or you're violent and abusive and antisocial.
Yeah. And I mean, changing the stigma
That's got to
is
be addressed.
always going to be difficult.
Yes. So it's incremental. It's going to take a while, but I think we have to be actively engaged in that work, or else it won't change.
Definitely, yeah. So I think that is all the questions that I had on those two papers. So do you have any kind of questions for me at the moment, or?
No, I don't think so. I think I've been impressed by your questions. They've been really good questions, and I'm really quite grateful that you've engaged with those studies and those papers as much as you have. So that's made this time really good and really enjoyable.
Oh, I'm very glad. The papers have been, really eye-opening to kind of see how other people have had these experiences. Growing up in I'd say a smaller town, myself I've had my own experiences, so kind of seeing how other people have experienced not only the kink community, but also, society viewing their kinks and their experiences with their own sexuality was quite refreshing to see.
Yeah.
It's very different and kind of quite strange to hear how in some places kink groups are readily accessible and easy to get to, and in other places it's very taboo. And again, thank you very much to you for agreeing to do the interview. It has been absolutely thrilling, kind of getting to talk to you for this kind of inaugural episode, talking about this. And I'm looking forward to the next couple of episodes talking more about the whole identity side of things, but with the different aspects of kind of kink and the understanding your body. So
Okay.
I think we'll leave it there for this episode, and we'll sort things for the next one. Okay.
I look forward to that. That would be good.
Well, thank you again for joining me, and I will catch you next time. Thanks for joining me on this first episode of Season 2. I will be back with Dr. Sprott in a future episode to discuss not only understanding your kinks, but also understanding your body. In the meantime, you can check out daxesdeviance.com for more information on the papers that we were talking about, and we have a blog on there too. So there's loads of fun stuff there. Until the next episode, goodbye.